In 1907, a doctor named Duncan MacDougall began an experiment that would later become one of the most famous and controversial experiments in history. His goal was simple. If something remains of a human after death, if that thing called the soul truly exists, could its presence be measured? Today, more than a century later, the name of this experiment is still repeated in books, films, articles, and even popular culture. And the reason is only one number. A number said to vanish from the human body at the moment of death. But before we reach that number, we first need to understand why this experiment was conducted in the first place. To understand this story, we must go back to the early 20th century, a time when questions of the soul, life after death, and communication with the dead were not confined to religious circles alone. At that time, a movement called spiritualism had gained great popularity. Many believed that the human soul continued to exist after death. Some even claimed it was possible to communicate with the dead. In this climate, scientists, doctors, theologians, and people who considered themselves mediums each sought evidence for these beliefs. But Duncan MacDougall chose a different path. The interesting thing is that he was not known as a superstitious person. Mary Roach, author of the book Spook Science Tackles the Afterlife, also said about him, "He doesn't sound like the kind of woo-woo tarot card reading mystic type." However, MacDougall had a hypothesis, one that would take his professional life in an unusual direction. He believed that if a person's personality, or consciousness, remained after death, it must exist in some physical form in the world. And if it had physical presence, maybe it had mass as well. And if it had mass, maybe it could be measured. In 1907, he published this idea in an article titled Hypothesis Concerning Soul Substance Together with Experimental Evidence of the Existence of Such Substance. But MacDougall did not stop at writing an article. He decided to test his hypothesis. To do this, he built a set of extremely sensitive scales. But from the outset, he faced a problem. If weight loss at the moment of death was to be measured, how could he be sure it was not caused by air leaving the lungs, or due to the evaporation of sweat, or other natural factors? MacDougall claimed that he had examined these issues. He had calculated that sweat evaporates at a rate of 1/60th of an ounce per minute. He even weighed himself during full inhalation and exhalation to see what effect air release had on the scale. Then the experiment began. 6 patients, 5 men and 1 woman, people who were in the final hours of their lives. And according to MacDougall's report, in all 6 cases, a small reduction in body weight was observed. But one of these measurements caught his attention more than the others. A patient suffering from tuberculosis was lying in bed with doctors present beside him. After the patient's death, MacDougall noticed that the scale's balance had suddenly shifted. The amount of weight loss was about 3/4 of an ounce, approximately 21 grams, the same number that would later define the experiment. But the story did not end there. MacDougall himself wrote in his report that measuring some patients was difficult. In one case, the patient died while he was still adjusting the scale. He also wrote, "Those who were opposed to our work created significant interference. Despite these problems, the results were published. And it did not take long before the New York Times headline read, 'Soul has weight, physician thinks.' Suddenly, an experiment conducted in a hospital became a public debate. But the more media attention increased, the more questions were raised. Did that number really mean anything? Or was there another explanation? Interestingly, MacDougall himself wrote a sentence in defense of his work that became less well known than the figure of 21 grams. He said, "I am fully aware that these few limited experiments are no more capable of proving this than a few swallows are capable of proving the coming of summer." But MacDougall's story did not end there. The story took an even stranger turn. If the 21-gram experiment could not give him a final answer, perhaps another way existed. Maybe instead of weighing the soul, it could be seen. At least, that was the path MacDougall pursued. A few years after publishing the 21-gram experiment, he turned his attention to an idea even more unusual than the first experiment, photographing the soul. In 1911, the New York Times published a report titled Photography of the Soul. The report stated that MacDougall was inspired by a medical researcher named William J. Kilner, known for his studies of human auras. But what MacDougall claimed went beyond observing auras. He believed that the presence of the soul could be recorded in X-ray images. He even described it as a light similar to interstellar ether. And perhaps most strangely, according to the New York Times report, he believed anyone can do this. Today, this claim seems unusual, but to understand it, we must return to the intellectual atmosphere of that time, a period when many questions about mind, consciousness, and death were still unknown, and the boundary between science, hypothesis, and speculation was often far thinner than it is today. But MacDougall did not have much opportunity to continue this path. He died at the age of 54, and as many later researchers have pointed out, the questions he left behind were far more than the answers he found. Years of silence followed, until in 2001 and 2005, new ideas were raised again, from weighing sheep to using electromagnetic sensors to record possible energy at the moment of death. But none produced a definitive answer. Over time, the experiment moved away from science and entered popular culture, appearing in films, novels, and anime, from the film 21 Grams to Dan Brown's novels, and even One Piece. In all these narratives, one thing remained common. The question remains unanswered to this day. And perhaps exactly that is why this story has endured. Not because of the number 21 grams, but because of the question itself.